Namaste. Welcome to this talk on Sri Aurobindo the Thinker. Now, whom do we call a great thinker or a thinker? This is a term that is applied to men and women who think deeply about subjects, give their scholarly insights. Perhaps we apply this also to philosophers and scientists and other great people. However, there is a paradox in the title itself when we apply it to Sri Aurobindo. Because thinking is associated with thoughts and mind. And the normal human mind processes 60,000-70,000 thoughts a day. That's a clamor of thinking that goes on in the mind for most of us. In Sri Aurobindo's case, one can say he's a thinker that perhaps did not think in the common sense of that word. Because going as far back as early 1900s, 1907 perhaps to be precise, Sri Aurobindo experienced a vacant mind, a silent mind, into which what was required came down and he expressed it spontaneously. Even when we look at his voluminous works, specifically those written during the Arya period, he said he would sit in front of the typewriter and stay silent, and what was required came down. So he wasn't a thinker in the traditional way we do thinking, but indeed he was a thinker of eminence, as we will see during the rest of this talk. Now, we will take up a variety of fields where Sri Aurobindo has given revealing insights. Let us start somewhat chronologically, at least initially, and later we will meander into many streams. As a political thinker, Sri Aurobindo returned to India from England at a very young age of 21. This was thereabouts in the early 1890s. And soon after his arrival, having been aware of the conditions in England and the way the common people lived there, and seeing the subjugation of the average Indian by the British, he was already stirred in his heart about the wretched condition of the common Indian. When someone asked him to contribute a few articles, he wrote for this magazine called Hindu Prakash, a political weekly perhaps. And he wrote a few articles describing how the Indian political thought was insufficient to address the problems of Indians. In a series of articles called New Lamps for the Old, he somewhat launched into a veiled criticism of the then Congress party that supplications to the Raj were not sufficient to ameliorate the condition of the average Indian. And when he went on this theme, soon enough he was dissuaded from his staunch criticism of the political landscape and the leading figures in politics at that time, who were actually somewhat happy being in the good books of the British, but not serving adequately the cause of Indian independence. So this was his first foray into political journalism. Later on, during the Bengal years, he wrote in Vande Mataram, where along with Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, he wrote several articles in this political publication called Bande Matra. In Barisal, in East Bengal, the situation became so difficult that the British banned the very utterance of the word Bande Mataram, of the phrase Bande Mataram. Sri Aurobindo, along with other political activists of that time, including Bipin Chandra Pal, led a procession of 6,000 people. So Sri Aurobindo's political thinking inspired thousands of Indians to take on the might of the British Empire. And when he wrote, Sri Aurobindo wrote with such dexterity, such fine command over the English language, that while criticizing the British Empire, one of the Britishers said, one could see sedition all over the article. One could see sedition all over the article, yet you could not prosecute him. That was the dexterity with which he wrote on the political subjects. Later on, he also went on to write in a Bengali weekly called Jugantar, whose editor was Sri Aurobindo's brother Birendra, but it was Sri Aurobindo who gave the call to action. As Sri Aurobindo's fight for India's independence crystallized, he gave several innovative and pioneering directives to the Indian political thought. First of all, Sri Aurobindo was one of the foremost freedom fighters who called for Purna Swaraj. Many people at that time who were in the front of negotiations with British were happy with a dominion status or something, a limited freedom under the crown, but Sri Aurobindo would have none of it. He called for complete independence. Enough is enough. Indians will govern India. British, please leave India for good. Categorical. No wishy-washy business. Similarly, when it came to the conception of India as Bharat Mata, as Mother India, which is how most of us visualize India today, even in our subconscious, as this great mother, it was Sri Aurobindo who gave this thought a very detailed description. When somebody asked him, how do you visualize India as the mother? He talked about how the physical topography of India, the hills, the valleys and rivers, they constituted her physical body. The culture of India and all the wonderful things that have existed in this land for many thousands of years ago, they were her consciousness. We, the Indians, are her living cells and tissue. And he said, visualize Mother India like this. He gave a lot more detailed description and he said, meditate upon her and develop genuine bhakti, the Navavidha bhakti that is prevalent. So he is the one who gave us a conception of Bharat Mata in a very vivid way that allowed us to relate to what he called the spiritual Godhead that presided over the destiny of India. There was a metaphysical aspect to it, not just an imagination of Bharat Mata. He said there are spiritual powers that guide the destiny of these lands, and India was presided over a power we called Bharat Mata and Bhavani Bharati and so on. But Sri Aurobindo's guidance was not left to this metaphysical conception. When he conceived of freedom for Indians in India, his political thought extended to how do you separate the Indian men and the problems that they faced from the oppressive British Raj. He conceived of a judiciary within India which was separate from the courts, which could do arbitration, adjudication, and address many of the problems. And those who would address these problems would be Indians, so that Indians address the problems of India in a legal way and have a parallel judiciary of sorts. Similarly, if you looked at economic aspect of India, Sri Aurobindo talked of economic nationalism. He was one of the earliest, and he was perhaps the earliest person to say boycott all British products. Stop supporting Britishers economically, because at that time India was being bled of its raw materials, and all of the industry in India was decimated by the British, where the products were coming manufactured in England and being sold to India. The textile industry of India is one of the famous examples where the British destroyed it and then took the raw material from India, produced fabric from British workers, and then sold it back to India. And Sri Aurobindo said, let us stop this. Swadeshi and boycott of foreign goods. Now, aside from all of this, Sri Aurobindo also gave a new definition, a new reason why India should be independent. It is not that, oh, you people are bad, you are oppressing us. He said there is a much deeper reason for India to be independent. The spiritual nationalism of Sri Aurobindo talked about India as a guiding light, a perennial source of light for the human civilization, and therefore freedom of India was important. So, when you look at the political thought of Sri Aurobindo, there is an entirely new way that Sri Aurobindo brought political vision to India. And that political vision persisted for many decades. When Gandhiji launched many of his agitations, for example, Swadeshi movement, where they were burning the foreign articles and goods, and similarly many other things, somebody wrote to Sri Aurobindo that Gandhiji's freedom struggle, the lines along which he is developing, is what you had envisaged and given in the 1910s. Somebody wrote this in 1930s. So you could see that the pioneering spirit, the freedom movement and the guidance that Sri Aurobindo had given to freedom movement lasted and influenced the Indian political thought for many decades to come. There is also spiritual journalism of Sri Aurobindo, one should look at when you talk about political journalism. For example, Karma Yogin, the magazine he brought out when he came out of the Alipur jail. At that time, he talked about how Karma Yogin would look at all the problems of India and seek first their spiritual roots and inner causes, and then proceed to the measures and the remedies. So he developed a spiritual outlook in Alipur jail. So we know that when he comes out, he went on into spiritual journalism, which continued in his Pondicherry years. Arya, as many of us know, for several years, he wrote on many spiritual themes and some of the cultural themes as well. So this is about the journalism, the political thought, the spiritual journalism of Sri Aurobindo. Then, let us look at Sri Aurobindo as an educationalist. During his Calcutta years, Sri Aurobindo realized that as long as the youth of this country was indoctrinated in the Macaulay education, it was difficult to redeem their thought from the constructs of colonialism and place it at the service of the nation. So, along with the leading educationalists of that time and leading thinkers of this time, Ishwara Chandra Vidyasagar, Rabindranath Tagore, Bipin Chandra Pal, and several others, Sri Aurobindo launched a movement for national education. They called it Council of Education, and they met in the City Hall. They laid out their thought of how to revive the greatness of Indian thought and expose our young children to the lofty work that Indians had done. Aryabhatta, Sushruta, Charaka, Varahamihira, Panini, so many great thinkers, most of them completely erased from the Indian consciousness. Their contributions completely subdued. So the Indian child, Indian youth were growing up with a vision of the greatness of India, but the greatness of British. But Sri Aurobindo wanted to bring out the greatness of India and place it into the consciousness at a young age of the Indian youth. The vision he gave was for a nationalist and cultural education for Indians to rebuild India. Later on, during the Pondicherry years, he laid out certain principles of education which Mother took up and further elaborated to bring integral education. For example, the 3 principles of integral education. Nothing can be taught, in that the teacher is a facilitator for the efflorescence of the knowledge hidden in the heart of the child. The mind must be consulted in its growth, where gradually it is the swadharma and the swabhava of the child flowers and opens up into the swadharma. And then from near to far. So these are the 3 principles of education that Sri Aurobindo gave, and Mother further elaborated upon them, brought in the physical, vital, mental, spiritual and psychic education and so on and so forth. And thankfully, even today, when NEP 2020 was being formulated, many of Sri Aurobindo's original insights and guidance are finding place in the national education policy of India. That is certainly very heartening. And one has to applaud the efforts of many of the people in the Sri Aurobindonian schools and Sri Aurobindonian thought to have influenced and made mainstream the light that Sri Aurobindo has given us in the field of education. So he was an educational thinker of a high degree. So that is something we can look at. Now, let us see the social aspect. Sri Aurobindo as a social thinker. Now, when one studies the field of philosophy, one sees social thinkers that address various aspects of thought of how humanity evolved, of how human societies were formed, and so on and so forth. Sri Aurobindo has 3 important writings: the human cycle, the ideal of human unity, war and self-determination. These address the fields of sociology and also anthropology, the evolution of human species. So if you take up the human cycle, it is the social manifesto of Sri Aurobindo. Initially, these articles were called together, they came out together under the title Psychology of Social Development. It presents the social philosophy of Sri Aurobindo. It throws deep insight. It addresses many of the themes associated with psychological and spiritual developments of human history. Those of us who have read the human cycle, we know how Sri Aurobindo talks about the typal age, the conventional age, the rationalistic and individual age, and how eventually it is expected to unfold into the spiritual age of humanity. Then there is this other book of Ideal of Human Unity. It is Sri Aurobindo's vision for unified humanity. It provides original insights into the understanding of societies and their evolution. They discuss the races, the thinking methods. It examines the problem of human unity and the methods adapted by man and nature in arriving at unity. The economic unity, social unity, political unity, administrative unity, militaristic unity, occupation of another country, and then a conglomerate of nations evolving together. So Sri Aurobindo looked at all these aspects. And Sri Aurobindo proposes a spiritual religion of humanity as the path towards their inner unity. Unless there is a soul level unity, a respect for the deepest level of man, and unless that happens, it is very difficult to find unity at the social level, at the superficial levels. That is how Sri Aurobindo looks at human unity. Then there is war and self-determination. As 2022 is a year of a significant war, not that the last 20 years weren't. We started with the Iraq war and so many Syria, Yemen, and now today Ukraine. Sri Aurobindo has an interesting observation that actually gives us a very profound idea of how he looks at it. So long as war does not become psychologically impossible, it will remain psychologically impossible. When there is a unity at a soul level, it is very difficult to think of the destruction of the other, because the destruction of the other implies a destruction of a part of me, because there is a deeper unity. And that psychological approach prevents me from waging war on the quote-unquote the other. This is how Sri Aurobindo views wars, and he says, unless psychologically we transcend it as humanity, it will remain. The vast spans over which Sri Aurobindo viewed the development of humanity, the social behavior patterns, the potential future of man based on our collective evolutionary trajectory, all of these make Sri Aurobindo one of the most prominent social thinkers of the 20th century. It is something all of us should take note, and particularly students of humanity should take a look at Sri Aurobindo in this aspect. Now, we talked about the sociology part. Let us look at a little bit of the psychology part, because again, Sri Aurobindo here has given groundbreaking ideas. Some of us who are familiar with Sri Aurobindo understands how Sri Aurobindo approached the human psychology. The constitution of the human has been analyzed by Sri Aurobindo in a very deep way. At a simplistic level, let us look at the physical, vital, and mental breakup of the individual. This comes from the traditional traditional Sanatana Dharma thought. Annamaya Purusha, Pranamaya Purusha, Manomaya Purusha. The three layers, and it goes on into the other layers. But Sri Aurobindo takes these up, and when you study his writings, he elaborates so much on each of these layers of human existence, and very importantly, the overlapping layers. What is the physical mind? What is the vital mind? All of these things, how each layer overlaps and impinges upon the other. This itself makes for many significant insights into human psychology. Then Sri Aurobindo goes on to the aspects of human existence below the physical, where he talks about the subconscient and the inconscient. And he says that many issues that we face as individuals, for example, anger control, all of these things, greed, they have their roots in the subconscient and the inconscient. And the subconscient and inconscient needs to be cleansed before lasting progress can be made at the physical, vital, and mental level. And then he talks about the superconscient layers, where there is a whole set of gradations going up to the highest level of Satchidananda, elaborated by the goal that is given in the traditional Sanatana Dharma. So he talks about how above this chaotic human mind that processes 60,000-70,000 thoughts, so many thoughts per second, where you really are not harnessing the power of the mind. Sri Aurobindo talks about how there is a silent mind, there is a higher mind, there is an illumined mind, intuitive mind, overmind, supermind, and then the Satchidananda. So on the superconscient front, Sri Aurobindo not only just says broadly that there is a superconscient element, he himself has traversed these stairs of higher consciousness and then defined each stair very, very clearly. When somebody talked about philosophy, Sri Aurobindo says, for me, this is not conjecture. I am writing what I experience. Often when you see the tarka, the philosophical discourses and discussions, each one is mentalizing what is going on and trying to defeat the other person. Sri Aurobindo approaches this very differently. He says, I disagree because my experience disagrees with what has been stated before me. So he has been opening up new frontiers, and on the superconscient front, Sri Aurobindo laid out the psychology of the future, how the human mind has to evolve. What are the important milestones? The specific methods may vary at arriving at these milestones. So much so that Sri Aurobindo says the future man will be very different in the thinking process and in the psychology. So Sri Aurobindo has expanded the field of psychology into the subconscious and inconscient realm and laid out a detailed set of milestones to evolve into the superconscient realm. And not only below and above, Sri Aurobindo also expands the psychological aspect. He says the individual is not in vacuum. He is open to the universal nature. So there is a constant interchange between the universal nature and the individual nature. So when there are so many thoughts occurring in us, some of these thoughts are percolating from the universal mind. And this is another very important way to look at it. It is not why I think a particular way. When I am in a certain physical location, the vibrations that are surrounding me impact the way I think. And as I become stronger in my spiritual capacity, I project this peace and silence into the atmosphere around me, and anyone who comes around me is impacted psychologically. So Sri Aurobindo has redefined how human psychology should approach the individual and has given many clues on how to improve the condition of the individual. So this is another area where Sri Aurobindo has made a pioneering contribution as a great thinker in the field of psychology. Then we should look at the contribution Sri Aurobindo has made to Indian culture and its renaissance. Foundations of Indian Culture. That is one of the pioneering books that Sri Aurobindo had written. It is actually a series of articles which initially were written to address the criticisms leveled against Indian culture. Because again, keep in mind, when India was under British rule, every possible effort was made to denigrate Indian culture. So there was a culture critic called Archer who wrote harsh articles decrying and degrading Indian culture without understanding the real substance behind it. So Sri Aurobindo took on this criticism and he brings out with luminous clarity the central vision of Indian culture. He talks about fundamental principles and values of religion and spirituality, philosophy and literature, art and architecture, society and politics of the ancient Indian civilization and culture. So he brings all of these in refuting the critics. Spirituality is the master key to understand Indian culture, Sri Aurobindo says. And he also wrote on the architecture aspect. He takes up the architecture of Sri Kalahasti, a temple near Tirupati. Similarly, the Simhachala temple near Vishakhapatnam. And he describes and writes about the special features of each of these temples. Even though Sri Aurobindo was not technically trained in these aspects, his yogic sadhana allowed him to develop insights and expertise in the field of painting, arts, architecture, and so on. He says one day while in Alipur jail, he saw painting after painting in his visions, and all the necessary knowledge of aesthetics appeared to him. So how we as common individuals train ourselves is very different to how rishis and yogis receive knowledge. That's all one can say. Now, let us look at Sri Aurobindo as a profound thinker of Sanatana Dharma. Here is someone who was educated for 21 years, practically, till the age of 21, maybe 16 years, but till the age of 21. in Western culture, comes back to India and launches himself, delves deep into India and its culture, studies, teaches himself Sanskrit, goes into treatises of Sanskrit, studies them, absorbs them, and then using his proficiency of expression gained in England in the English language, he goes on to write upon them. In a field as profound as Vedas, Sri Aurobindo brought out original insights. So much so that scholars and accomplished siddhas in that domain who dedicated their lives to the studies of Vedas said Sri Aurobindo has given us new revelations of how to understand the Veda. Amongst the foremost of them was Sri Kapali Shastriyar, a disciple initially of Vasishta Ganapati Muni, a student and a disciple of Vasishta Ganapati Muni, who eventually reached the feet of Sri Ramana Maharshi and later came to Sri Aurobindo Ashram and surrendered himself at the feet of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. He says how when he read Sri Aurobindo's writings on the secret of the Veda in Arya, they were so scintillating. And this is somebody who is already a scholar and a siddha. He says, I would read articles of Sri Aurobindo on the Vedas and other topics in Arya again and again till the next issue came. Such was the profundity with which Sri Aurobindo wrote. In the Pondicherry years, when Sri Aurobindo wrote Hymns to the Mystic Fire, his translations of the Rigs, some of the Rigs of Rig Veda, the mother commented that when she visited Sri Aurobindo's room during this period, she saw Agni standing there. Because Hymns to the Mystic Fire is about the Karma Kanda, offering into the fire. That was the stage from which Sri Aurobindo gave tremendous insights into the traditional aspects of Sanatana Dharma. Sri Aurobindo was not just a thinker, he was a drishta, a rishi of the yore. What he gave to Sanatana Dharma is something that expanded the frontiers of Sanatana Dharma. It also brought out the original wealth of Sanatana Dharma in a language which is accessible to all of us. Many Indians today, including me, are not proficient in Sanskrit. We are unable to access the old knowledge except through a translator, which means the knowledge we will receive is attenuated to the mental capacity of the translator. But here is Sri Aurobindo, who embodied the truths of Sanatana Dharma, a drishta, a rishi, a maharshi, who is writing in a language that is accessible to us in English. All the knowledge of Sanatana Dharma given to us in English. So that is Sri Aurobindo's contribution in Sanatana Dharma. Sri Aurobindo's Gita, the Upanishads, the list of many classics of Sanatana Dharma literature is now available in English from Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo as a poet par excellence. Sri Aurobindo started writing poetry at a very young age, mostly in English. In fact, all of it in English, perhaps. Around 200 poems Sri Aurobindo has penned. Sri Aurobindo talks about the utility of poetic imagery. He says that poetry, far better than prose, lends itself to communication of higher realms. What one sees can be indicated or pointed to much better through poetry than through prose. A turn of phrase here, a pointer there, recreates the imagery that the seer has in his mind, and that imagery helps the reader approach or approximate to the thought or the imagery that is existing in the poet's mind. So in this context, Sri Aurobindo has written extensively in the spiritual realm. He has poems on the Advaitic themes, and his masterpiece, the classic Savitri, extending to 24,000 lines, considered to be one of the finest pieces of poetry in English literature, one of the longest as well. So Savitri, occult, magical, miraculous, so many things are attributed to Savitri. Savitri, in a way, brings the sadhana of Sri Aurobindo lasting 40-50 years. It is a spiritual poetry that is given there. The mother herself said there were times when she was undergoing very advanced spiritual experiences. And when she saw the poetry in Savitri that Sri Aurobindo was writing in these periods, she said, my spiritual experiences are transcribed in Savitri. It is a powerful book. It is, some of the followers of Sri Aurobindo regard Savitri as a new Veda, a revelatory poetry that allows access to the mantric capacities, that allows spiritual power to flow into us. This is how highly Savitri is regarded. And then there is Sri Aurobindo's book on future poetry. Sri Aurobindo's vision of the future poetry based on the concept of the mantra of the real. So Sri Aurobindo has this book on future poetry where he talks about how intuitive expressions find their way through the mind into the physical poetry, the mantric capacity of poetry. All of these are expounded in that book. Another area which we must touch upon when we think of Sri Aurobindo as a thinker is the use of language and the turn of phrase. Sri Aurobindo as a linguist, Sri Aurobindo and English literature. The arrogance that existed amongst the rulers at that time, or the thinkers, the English thinkers at that time, was one of them had the audacity to say, the entire Asian field of literature would barely fill a bookshelf in my library. So here are so-called high society thinkers of London who would travel to India, take a superficial and dismissive look at what existed and go back and make statements which were applauded that there is nothing worthwhile considering in these conquered lands of fallen, wretched people. This was the attitude, many of us are aware of it. Sri Aurobindo wrote so many profound works that it was imperative that the British philosophers, thinkers, academicians had to sit up and take note. And they were almost convinced themselves, and they acknowledged that these were among the greatest literature produced by mankind. One of the professors exclaimed, "Can a man write like this?" So, Sri Aurobindo's contribution in this domain is something to be regarded highly, though as followers of Sri Aurobindo, many prefer to focus on the spiritual and yogic aspect and at most the academic aspect, but not as much on the aspect of linguistics. This is again a field worth exploring for students in particular who are doing doctorates. Sri Aurobindo stands as one of the finest writers, finest Indians writing in English, perhaps never surpassed even to this day. Then we come to the field of philosophy proper. When we take up Western philosophy, Sri Aurobindo can be considered to be an evolutionary philosopher. We all know evolutionary philosophers. So Darwin's Origin of Species came out, talks about how there was an evolution starting from stone to plant to animal to man, the tadpole experiments and observations and all of that. Samuel Alexander, a contemporary of Sri Aurobindo in the early days, Teilhard de Chardin in the 20th century. Today, for example, we can look at Richard Dawkins. All of these are evolutionary philosophers. And Sri Aurobindo talked in a similar vein, but in a very different way also. When we talk to the traditional evolutionary philosophers and say, fine, I mean, man has come from animal and all that, but where do we go forward from here? There would only be a certain theoretical conjecture about the future evolution of mankind from all the evolutionary philosophers. None of them could tell you definitively where man would go or how mind would evolve. And when it came to the man himself, they would say, there's nothing you can do. Nature evolves, so you just enjoy your life, lead it according to the ethical and moral frameworks that appeal to you, and then nature will help you grow and humanity will evolve. But Sri Aurobindo did not view evolution that way. There were three important differences. First, Sri Aurobindo viewed double evolution. He looked at the evolution of the soul and he looked at the evolution of humanity. Both interlinked to each other. Sri Aurobindo believed in the evolution and emancipation of human soul from its ignorance. It was inevitable. And there is the larger context of evolution of humanity. He looked at that as well. And then the third aspect that Sri Aurobindo brought in was that evolution can be accelerated. Yoga sadhana, Sri Aurobindo viewed as compression of human evolution of several lives into one life. So these are some important differences compared to the Western philosophers. Man is a transitional being, Sri Aurobindo says. And gradually we have to awaken ourselves to the latent potential to transcend the limitations of human nature and evolve into a superior being. So this is the gist of Sri Aurobindo's position as an evolutionary philosopher in the framework of Western philosophy. Now, when we come to Indian philosophy, we have Shad Darsana, and Sri Aurobindo broadly falls into someone whom we could say is into the Advaitic form. The Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaiseshika, Purvamamsha and Uttarvamamsha. So that is where the Vedanta part comes in. But there are also important differences between Sri Aurobindo's approach towards Advaita and the traditional Advaitism. The traditional Advaitism talks about Ishvara, Brahman, talks about the Jiva, and then we talk about Maya. There is the self and there is the non-self. There is the rope and there is the snake. And actually, the struggle as the soul goes through in this journey of liberation, the soul is completely imbued or immersed in Maya. Then the question becomes, if the soul is so immersed in Maya, then there must be two things. There is the Jivatman and then there is Maya. So it is not exactly Advaita, it is actually Dvaita. But then the discussion becomes, no. Maya is illusory, but it is not real. When we ask this specific question, and this is how Ramanuja, who came after Shankara, he actually pinned down Advaita, the Shankara Advaita, on this particular topic of Maya. He says, does Maya exist or it doesn't exist? Advaita kind of straddles somewhere in the middle. He says, Advaita says, yes, it exists to the point where it misleads the individual, but it doesn't exist once you are liberated. So there is no clarity on this concept of Maya. This is where Sri Aurobindo differs. While Sri Aurobindo accepts that Jivatman and Paramatman are the same, that there is a Supreme Brahman, all of that he accepts. He actually says that the Jagat is not Maya. The Jagat has the immanent divine. There is divine in the Jagat. It just has to be revealed. So, in Sri Aurobindo's path, you are not expected to reject the world as Maya. You are expected to accept the world with the idea that there is divinity. There is divinity in this Jagat. And the divinity will reveal itself. Ishavasyam idam sarvam. In a literal sense, not in a figurative sense. In a literal sense. And the work of Sri Aurobindo about the descent of the supermind is about bringing down the highest light into the atoms of the matter. Bringing that golden light of supermind and incorporating it cell by cell to transform the ignorance into the greatest knowledge, into the supreme light. This is the sadhana of Sri Aurobindo. We will be going off topic, but this reality of this, because many people will think, oh, this is a very great, wonderful illusion that may never come true. When Sri Aurobindo left his body, for a decade or longer, he was working on bringing down the light of the supermind and embed it into the matter so that the matter from ignorance is able to be illumined. The golden light of supermind came down and Sri Aurobindo was purifying the earth consciousness at the time he left the body to bring in that golden light and embed it. And he himself offered his body as a piece of matter receiving this light, and through his sadhana he received that golden light, and when he left his body for a few days, that golden light emanated from his body. It is recorded, newspaper clippings at that time wrote about it. So when we talk about the sadhana of Sri Aurobindo and we look at Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, it is Purna Advaita. It doesn't reject matter as illusion. It accepts matter also. It accepts Ishvara, Jiva, Jagat as a single entity which is manifesting the highest consciousness or which is to manifest the highest consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo's works in the spiritual philosophy line, Life Divine, Synthesis of Yoga, etc., stand as the greatest works existing in humanity today. So in the Eastern philosophy, we can consider Sri Aurobindo's books as pioneering contributions. Pioneering contributions. We have to look at these aspects carefully. And as an extension to this, Sri Aurobindo's contributions to Sanatana Dharma, one also has to look at Sri Aurobindo as a yogi. As a yogi, Sri Aurobindo talked about synthesizing many parts. The Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga do not exist as independent paths for Sri Aurobindo. He says the same person may traverse all of these paths and incorporate the learnings of each of these paths into himself so that he can grow spiritually. It can be successive depending on the stage of one's life. It can be parallel depending on one's capacity to spend time on different parts of bhakti, jnana and karma. And not only that, he actually expounded on a new path in addition to these three, the path of self-perfection. He wrote an entire series of chapters on how humanity has to work on perfecting itself within the instruments that one has. How does the mind, from its chaotic state, evolve to a state of perfection? He says, as one works with the mind and evolves it, it can arrive at a status of equanimity. What we attribute to the quality of a rishi begins to manifest in us. So the perfection of these instruments of emotion, instrument of physicality, instrument of thought, all of these have to be taken up. The social and ethical framework is not enough to control man. Man has to evolve with the spiritual principles. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo talks about how man in his current condition, with a bit of effort, can evolve beyond time and space, which are also instruments of ignorance when it comes to the highest realizations. In our Puranic literature, we have rishis who have Trikala Drishti, the past and the future and the present, all of them they can see. And Sri Aurobindo writes in Yoga of Self-Perfection how time and space appear to a self-realized man and how we can go into a sadhana of self-perfection where this can manifest in us. And as we discussed earlier, Sri Aurobindo espouses Vedanta to a certain degree. He says integral yoga is the method of Vedanta with the aim of Tantra. The method of Vedanta in terms of purification, Vichara, Viveka, inner Vairagya and all of this. Method of Tantra, what is it? The Tantra does not reject the world. Tantra accepts the world and says the joyful manifestation of the divine powers in this world is the fulfillment of Tantra, Bhukti. So Sri Aurobindo says we have to use the methods of Vedanta, develop detachment, develop inner Vairagya, and yet receive the bounty of the divine and manifest in this world. And we talked about ascent and descent, how the higher light manifests and it helps the lower nature to transcend itself. Similarly, involution and evolution. The reason man is evolving to a higher species is because something of the divine has descended already as a seed in this evolution. So Sri Aurobindo views this evolution not just as a linear path upwards. He traces it as a cycle, something from above coming down and something from below going up. And one of the important areas of yoga of Sri Aurobindo is the realization of what Sri Aurobindo calls as the psychic being or the Antaratman, somewhat similar. And one has to go deep inside and realize the divine in ourselves. And that is one of the important aspects of Sri Aurobindo's sadhana. So, as you can see, we talked about a variety of fields in which Sri Aurobindo has given original insights and broadened the field, extended the field. We talked about political thinker. We talked about Sri Aurobindo as a spiritual thinker. We talked about Sri Aurobindo's contribution to redefining the thinking of Indian politics. We talked about Sri Aurobindo as an educationalist and a thinker there, a social thinker in the field of psychology, in the field of Indian culture and renaissance of Indian culture, a profound thinker in the field of Sanatana Dharma, a poet par excellence in the field of English literature and as a linguist, and as a thinker who has changed the thought process in Western philosophy as well as Indian philosophy. So many different domains Sri Aurobindo has contributed. Stepping back, in a way, the current general Indian perception of Sri Aurobindo is very two-dimensional and very restrictive. Mahayogi, that is Sri Aurobindo. No. Sri Aurobindo's contribution, while great as Mahayogi, spans so many different fields. There have been many yogis and Mahayogis in the last 500 years in India. If one has to compare Sri Aurobindo to anyone who has made such pioneering contributions in so many versatile facets, One has to go back perhaps even 1,000 years. Somewhere 900 to 1,000 years before Sri Aurobindo's arrival, there is the figure of Abhinavagupta in Kashmiri Saivism. It is somewhat comparable to the number of fields in which pioneering contribution has been made. Abhinavagupta wrote on Tantra. He wrote philosophy of Kashmiri Shaivism, poetry, dramatics of Kalidasa, Natya Shastra of Bharatamuni. On all of these, he has given expositions. So, one can, and today India has forgotten Abhinavagupta also. How many people really even know of him? And he is one of the people who stands tall. And 1,000 years later comes Sri Aurobindo, and again a towering figure in the landscape of India. Yet, many Indians do not know of Sri Aurobindo's greatness. It is time that India rediscovers Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo says, "My life is not on the surface for man to see." Now, we spent an hour discussing so many wonderful things Sri Aurobindo has done, and yet he says, what you are seeing on the outside is not really my life. What does he mean by that? It means that even when we think of Sri Aurobindo as a great thinker, that still limits what he was. So what was he? The mother says, Sri Aurobindo was a decisive action direct from the Supreme. When we view divinity, when we think of this God, the Nirakara that exists, from time to time, a ray of light comes down to help humanity overcome the plateau it had reached and move to the next higher level. Sambhavami yuge yuge. Because unless the pure, vital man of Parashurama was exceeded by Sattvaguna Purushottama Sri Rama, man would consider violence as the highest ideal. That is what would have happened if the Dashavatar had stopped with Parashurama. It is okay to kill people and avenge righteously what needs to be avenged. Parashurama was followed by Raghurama, Sattvaguna Sampanna, the one who manifested the highest ethical and moral philosophy of possible to man. Yet today, humanity stands at a crossroads with chaotic mind, greed, power dominating the human consciousness. The law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest in the crudest form, manipulation, that is what has today caused the catastrophe that humanity is. The planet being endangered, the species being trampled upon by its own. Where does humanity go from here? This is where Sri Aurobindo has given a revealing light. Transcending our human mind is the key to not only the growth of humanity, but even the survival of humanity today. This was the greatness of Sri Aurobindo. And we are looking at this great light manifest, and by calling him a thinker, we are applying a small prism of the mind and saying, wow, he was a great thinker. He was much more than that. So that, my friends, is the broad canvas that I wanted to paint for you when we talked of Sri Aurobindo as a thinker. Thank you very much, and we'll meet again. Namaste.